The Kursk salient was a bulge in the Soviet line that extended 200 kilometers west into German-held territory, 150 kilometers north to south, representing the furthest point of Soviet advance following their winter offensive. By early summer 1943, it had become the most fortified piece of real estate in human history. The Soviets knew the Germans would attack it. The Germans knew the Soviets knew. And neither side could avoid the confrontation that geography and strategic necessity had made inevitable. The battle that would unfold here would be the largest tank engagement in history, involving over 6,000 armored vehicles, 2 million men, and 4,000 aircraft. It would mark the turning point of the Eastern Front, the moment when German offensive capability was permanently broken and the long retreat toward Berlin began. But the official histories would never mention what else occurred in the skies above Kursk during those first terrible days of July. What the pilots saw, what the radar operators tracked, what disappeared men who were never found, and left wreckage that defied explanation. The German plan was straightforward in concept, devastating in execution. Army Group South, under Field Marshal von Manstein, would strike north from Belgorod. Army Group Center under Field Marshal Model would strike south from Orel. The two pincers would meet east of Kursk, encircling and destroying the Soviet forces trapped within the salient. It was the last great German offensive on the Eastern Front, and it required total commitment of Germany's remaining strategic reserves. If it succeeded, the war in the East might be stabilized. If it failed, there would be no reserves left to stop the Soviet advance that everyone knew was coming. The Soviets, for their part, had used the spring months to transform the salient into a killing ground. Marshal Zhukov had overseen the construction of 8 defensive belts, stretching back 150 kilometers, each belt consisting of interconnected trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, artillery positions, and interlocking fields of fire. Over 500,000 mines had been laid. Every approach had been studied, every kill zone calculated. The Germans would attack where the Soviets wanted them to attack, and they would be ground down in prepared defenses that extended so deep that breaking through was practically impossible. But the battle would not be fought on the ground alone. Air superiority was critical, and both sides had concentrated their tactical air forces in the region. The Luftwaffe had assembled over 2,000 aircraft, Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, Focke-Wulf FDW-190 fighter bombers, Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, and Heinkel He-111 medium bombers. The Soviet Air Force countered with nearly 3,000 aircraft, primarily Yakovlev Yak-9 fighters, Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft, and Petlyakov P-2 dive bombers. The skies would be as contested as the ground, perhaps more so. Major Hans Richter, commander of 3rd Gruppe, Jagdgeschwader 52, stood beside his Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6 at the forward airfield near Kharkov at 0330 hours on 5 July. The aircraft was painted in the standard camouflage scheme of gray-green upper surfaces and light blue undersides, the fuselage marked with the yellow cowling and white theater band that identified the Eastern Front operations. His personal markings, 23 victory symbols painted beneath the cockpit, represented 23 Soviet aircraft destroyed over the past 18 months. He was 26 years old, a veteran of campaigns from Poland to the gates of Moscow, and he had learned that survival depended on vigilance, aggression, and a certain amount of luck that could run out at any moment. The briefing had been conducted at 0200 hours in a tent that smelled of gasoline and unwashed bodies. The objective was clear: achieve air superiority over the northern attack sector, destroy Soviet ground attack aircraft before they could interdict German armor, and maintain combat air patrols throughout the day to prevent Soviet bombers from reaching the forward assembly areas. Expected opposition? Heavy. Expected casualties? Significant. Expected weather? Clear. Visibility unlimited. perfect flying conditions. What the briefing had not mentioned, what no one had mentioned because no one understood it yet, were the reports that had begun filtering in from reconnaissance flights over the past week. Strange radar contacts that appeared and disappeared without correlation to known aircraft. Visual sightings by pilots who described objects moving at speeds that exceeded any known aircraft's capabilities. Good radio interference that sounded like static but carried patterns within it, almost like voices, though no language anyone recognized. Intelligence had dismissed these reports as equipment malfunction, atmospheric conditions, or the strain of operating in a combat theater where death could come from any direction at any moment. Pilots under stress saw things. Radar operators misinterpreted returns. The war was full of strange phenomena that had mundane explanations once properly investigated. But the reports had been consistent enough that some pilots, the ones who paid attention to what wasn't being said in briefings, had begun to wonder if something else was operating in the skies over Kursk, something that neither side had anticipated and neither side controlled. Richter climbed into his cockpit at 0345 hours, his crew chief helping him strap into the harness, checking connections, ensuring the oxygen system was functioning. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engine started with a roar that shattered the pre-dawn quiet, 12 cylinders producing 1,475 horsepower, enough to push the 9,000-pound fighter to speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. Around him, 11 other Bf-10-9s were starting their engines, the sound building to a sustained thunder that made conversation impossible. At 0400 hours, the first wave of German aircraft began taking off. Richter's Gruppe was assigned to the second wave, scheduled for 0430 departure. He sat in his cockpit, running through mental checklists, checking instruments, listening to the radio chatter as the first fighters reported reaching their patrol sectors. The reports were routine: clear skies, no contact, visibility unlimited, everything proceeding according to plan. Then, at 0422 hours, the radio crackled with a transmission that made Richter's hand tighten on the control stick. It was the voice of Hauptmann Werner Vogel, leader of the first wave, his tone carrying an edge that experienced pilots recognized immediately as controlled fear. Adler leader to all units. I have visual on unknown contacts. Repeat, unknown contacts. Altitude 10,000 meters, bearing north, speed, impossible speed. Not Soviet aircraft. Not any aircraft I recognize. Request identification assistance. The operations officer responded immediately. Adler leader, describe contacts. There was a pause. Static crackled. Then Vogel's voice returned, higher now, tension breaking through professional discipline. Circular, metallic, no wings, no tail. Moving in formation, but not like any formation I've seen. They're turning, coming toward us, speed increasing. God in heaven, how are they moving that fast? Adler leader, maintain position and observe. Do not engage unknown contacts. Acknowledge. Another pause, longer this time. Then, they're all around us. They're circling the formation, making no hostile moves, but they're close, too close. I can see them clearly now. No markings, no canopy, no visible means of propulsion. Just smooth metal surfaces reflecting sunlight. They're watching us. I know that sounds insane, but I can feel it. They're observing us. Richter exchanged glances with his wingman, Lieutenant Franz Becker, in the adjacent aircraft. Becker's expression mirrored his own confusion and unease. Whatever Vogel was seeing, it wasn't in the briefing. It wasn't in anyone's intelligence estimates. And it was happening right now. In the skies, where Richter and his pilots would be flying in 8 minutes. The radio fell silent for 30 seconds. Then Vogel's voice returned, calmer now, but carrying an undercurrent of something Richter had never heard from the veteran pilot before. Not fear exactly. Awe. They're leaving, accelerating straight up, speed beyond anything possible. They're gone. We've lost visual, no radar contact. It's as if they were never here. The operations officer's response was clipped and professional. Adler Leader, return to base for debriefing. Adler 2, assume patrol duties. Understood. Adler Leader returning to base. At 0430 hours, Richter's Gruppe took off into a sky that should have been empty except for the gathering forces of two great armies preparing to destroy each other. But as he climbed through 5,000 meters, watching the sun break over the eastern horizon and illuminate the landscape below where millions of men were preparing to kill each other, he felt something he had never felt in combat before. The sensation that the battle about to unfold was being watched, not by reconnaissance aircraft or high-altitude observers, but by something else. Something that had capabilities neither side possessed and motivations neither side understood. Something that had chosen this place, this time, this apocalyptic confrontation, to manifest and observe. The screeching skies of Kursk were about to reveal themselves. And what the pilots on both sides would experience in the days to come would challenge everything they understood about warfare, physics, and the boundaries of the possible. The greatest tank battle in history was beginning, but it would not be fought alone. Something else was present in those skies, something that screeched. Major Richter's Staffel reached their assigned patrol sector at 0512 hours. 12 BF-10-9s arranged in loose finger four formations at 7,000 meters altitude. The sky was clear, visibility extending to the horizon, and below them, the opening salvos of Operation Citadel were already underway. Artillery barrage had commenced at 0430, thousands of guns firing simultaneously, creating a continuous rolling thunder that could be heard even at altitude. Smoke was beginning to obscure sections of the front line as German armor began its advance into the first belt of Soviet defenses. Richter's orders were simple: maintain air superiority over the northern attack corridor, engage any Soviet aircraft attempting to interfere with the ground offensive, and provide close air support if called upon. Standard fighter operations. He had executed similar missions hundreds of times over the past 2 years, but the radio transmission from Hauptmann Vogel had changed the calculus. Something was up here that wasn't Soviet and wasn't German, something that moved in ways that defied aerodynamics and disappeared when observed too closely. The first Soviet aircraft appeared at 0534 hours, a formation of 6 Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovix, heavily armored ground attack aircraft designed to destroy tanks and infantry positions, approaching from the northeast at low altitude. They were escorted by 4 Yak-9 fighters positioned above and behind them, standard Soviet doctrine. Richter assessed the situation in seconds, then keyed his radio. Grünherz aircraft. This is Grünherz Leader. Engage the fighters first. Break on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Mark. The formation split, elements diving toward the Soviet fighters, while Richter led his section in a high-side gun pass against the Sturmovix. The battle developed as battles always developed, violent, chaotic, decided in seconds. One Yak-9 exploded under concentrated fire from Lieutenant Becker. Another went down trailing smoke, pilot bailing out. The Sturmovix attempted to scatter, but they were too slow, too heavily loaded. Richter's cannon shells walked across one aircraft's wing route, severing control cables. It rolled inverted and began the long fall toward the ground 4 kilometers below. The engagement lasted 90 seconds. When it was over, 3 Sturmovix were destroyed. 2 were fleeing north trailing smoke, and 2 Yak-9s were down. Richter's formation had taken no losses, though one aircraft reported minor damage from defensive fire. Textbook interception, exactly what they had trained for. But as Richter pulled his aircraft back to altitude and reformed his formation, his radio crackled with transmissions from other units operating in adjacent sectors. The words were different, the voices were different, but the message was consistent. Unknown contacts, objects moving at impossible speeds, radar returns that appeared and vanished, and something else, something that was being reported by multiple pilots across the entire combat zone. A sound, a high-pitched screeching that penetrated cockpits, overwhelmed radio frequencies, and sent instruments spinning. It wasn't engine noise. It wasn't mechanical. It was something else, something organic or electronic or both, a sound that human ears weren't designed to process, but that human brains interpreted as threat at the most fundamental level. At 0647 hours, Richter heard it for the first time. His radio had been quiet, his formation cruising at patrol altitude, scanning for new Soviet formations. Then the sound erupted from his headset, so loud and so sudden that he instinctively pulled the headphones away from his ears. It was a shriek, a screech, a sound like metal tearing combined with an animal's scream of rage, modulated at frequencies that created pain behind the eyes and nausea in the gut. The sound lasted 5 seconds. When it stopped, Richter's radio was filled with confused transmissions from his pilots. They had all heard it, all felt it. And as they scanned their instruments, they discovered that compasses were spinning, altimeters were fluctuating, and fuel gauges were reading differently than they had moments before. Grunhertz leader, this is 3. I have visual on contact bearing north, high altitude, single object, climbing, speed excessive. Richter looked north. At first he saw nothing. Then at the edge of visibility, perhaps 10 kilometers distant and several thousand meters above them, he saw it. A silver disk, perfectly circular, catching sunlight as it rotated slowly. No wings, no tail, no visible means of propulsion, just a smooth, metallic surface that reflected light in ways that suggested material composition unlike anything he had encountered. The disk was climbing. Richter watched it ascend from approximately 10,000 meters to 15,000 in less than 10 seconds, acceleration that would have torn any conventional aircraft apart. It reached what appeared to be its desired altitude, then simply stopped, hovering in defiance of gravity and momentum. It remained motionless for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it moved again, not accelerating gradually, but simply transitioning from stationary to supersonic in an instant, disappearing to the east faster than Richter's eyes could track. He keyed his radio, keeping his voice level despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Grunhertz aircraft, maintain formation. Do not pursue unknown contacts. Report all sightings, but do not engage. Acknowledge. The acknowledgements came back quickly, his pilots recognizing command authority, even in unprecedented circumstances. But Richter could hear the strain in their voices. These were men who had faced death dozens of times, who had fought Soviet fighters that outnumbered them 3-1, who had flown through flak so thick it looked like solid walls of explosions. They were not easily rattled, but what they had just witnessed had rattled them. Because it was not war, it was something else, something that operated outside the rules that governed their understanding of aerial combat. The morning progressed and the sightings multiplied. Pilots from both Luftwaffe and Soviet Air Force began reporting similar contacts. The descriptions varied in detail but matched in fundamentals. Disc-shaped or spherical objects, metallic surfaces, impossible acceleration, and that sound. The screeching that accompanied their appearances and departures, a sound that several pilots described as almost communicative, as if it carried meaning they couldn't quite decode. At 09:23 hours, a Soviet fighter pilot named Captain Alexei Volkov of the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment engaged one of the objects. Volkov was a veteran with 14 confirmed victories, a competent and aggressive pilot who had survived since the first days of the German invasion. His wingman, Junior Lieutenant Pavel Fedorov, watched the engagement from 500 meters distance and later provided the only detailed account of what occurred. According to Fedorov's report, filed with his regiment commander and subsequently forwarded to higher headquarters where it would be classified and suppressed, Volkov had pursued a silver disc that had appeared above their formation. The object was initially stationary, hovering at 8,000 meters. Volkov, interpreting it as some kind of German secret weapon, had closed to within 200 meters and opened fire with his 20mm cannon. The shells passed through the space the object occupied with no visible effect. No hits registered, no damage apparent. The disc had simply remained motionless as Volkov expended approximately 60 rounds of ammunition at point-blank range. Then the screeching had begun, so loud that Fedorov, 500 meters away, heard it clearly over his engine noise. And the disc had moved. It did not turn to face Volkov. It did not maneuver. It simply moved, instantaneously appearing 2 kilometers distant, then returning to its original position, then moving again, creating a pattern around Volkov's aircraft that suggested not evasion, but demonstration, showing capability, displaying power. And then it had stopped, hovering once more, and Volkov's aircraft had simply fallen from the sky. Not shot down, not exploded, just fallen. Engines still running, controls apparently responding, but falling as if all lift had been negated, as if the aircraft had forgotten how to fly. Volkov had bailed out at 3,000 meters, parachuting safely into Soviet-held territory. His aircraft had impacted in an open field, burying itself 3 meters deep, the crater suggesting velocity far greater than normal crash dynamics. When recovery teams reached the site later that day, they found the aircraft relatively intact despite the impact. But every instrument was destroyed, melted from within as if subjected to intense electromagnetic radiation. The radio was fused, the compass had liquefied, and Volkov, when questioned, could only repeat the same phrase. It looked at me. It knew I was there, and it decided I was not a threat, so it let me live. By 1100 hours, the sky above Kursk had become a battle space unlike any in history. Conventional aerial combat continued, German and Soviet aircraft engaging each other in dogfights and ground attack missions that produced dozens of kills on both sides. But weaving through that conventional warfare were the others. The discs, the spheres, the objects that moved according to rules that neither side understood and that seemed indifferent to the massive human conflict unfolding beneath them. Major Richter landed at 12:45 hours, his fuel state critical after 4 hours of continuous patrol. He climbed out of his cockpit exhausted, dehydrated, and fundamentally shaken in ways that combat had never managed to shake him. His crew chief approached with water and a status report on the aircraft. Richter drank without tasting, staring at the sky where more fighters were climbing to relieve his formation. His operations officer, Major Klaus Brenner, met him at the operations tent. "Hans, I need your report. Command is demanding details on these unknown contacts. You're one of the few who's actually seen them clearly." Richter drank more water, then spoke carefully, choosing words that would not sound insane when read by officers who had not witnessed what he had witnessed. They are not Soviet. They are not German. They are not any nation's aircraft. They move in ways that violate physics as we understand it. They demonstrate awareness and purpose. And they do not appear hostile unless engaged directly. But they are here, Klaus, in numbers. And they are watching the battle, observing it, as if we are an experiment they are conducting. Brenner absorbed this, his expression grim. Intelligence has reports from across the entire front, both sides. The Soviets are seeing them too. Their pilots are just as confused as ours. Whatever these things are, They are not taking sides. They are simply present. Has anyone determined what they want? No, but there is a theory, an insane theory, but the only one that fits the facts. Tell me. Brenner looked around, ensuring no one was within earshot. The Battle of Kursk is the largest military engagement in history. 2 million men, 6,000 tanks, 4,000 aircraft. The concentration of force, of violence, of human intention and fear and aggression is unprecedented. Some of the intelligence analysts are suggesting that this concentration has attracted attention, that whatever these objects are, they are drawn to conflict on this scale, that they feed on it or study it or simply witness it, that we have created conditions that made our presence impossible for them to ignore. Richter considered this. It should have sounded absurd, but after what he had seen, after what he had felt when that disc had appeared and the screeching had penetrated his skull and made his instruments fail, he could not dismiss it. What are our orders? Continue operations, engage Soviet aircraft, complete the mission, and if we encounter the others, observe and report, but do not engage unless they demonstrate hostile intent. And if they do demonstrate hostile intent, Brenner had no answer. No one had an answer, because the truth was becoming clear to anyone paying attention. If the objects in the sky above Kursk decided to act, neither side had any capability to stop them. They were as far beyond German and Soviet technology as those nations were beyond medieval warfare. And they were here, in increasing numbers, for reasons no one understood. The Battle of Kursk would continue for 3 more weeks. It would be one of the most brutal engagements of the war, producing hundreds of thousands of casualties and definitively ending Germany's offensive capability on the Eastern Front. But the pilots who flew through those skies would never forget the other battle, the one that was not fought, the presence that watched and screeched and moved through the air as if the laws of physics were optional suggestions rather than immutable constraints. Something had come to Kursk, something that would never be mentioned in the official histories, something that both sides would classify and suppress and eventually pretend had never happened. But the pilots remembered. They always would, because they had seen what lurked in the screeching skies, and they knew that humanity's greatest battles were being observed by forces that regarded human warfare the way humans might regard ants fighting over territory too small to see. The second day of the battle brought confirmation that what had begun as isolated sightings was becoming systematic presence. By dawn on the 6th of July, every major air unit operating over Kursk, German, Soviet, and the few Allied reconnaissance flights monitoring the battle from distance had logged encounters with the unknown objects. The reports were no longer anomalies to be dismissed. They were operational facts that required acknowledgement and response. Major Richter's second sortie launched at 05:45 hours. His Gruppe had been reinforced overnight, bringing his strength back to full complement after the previous day's attrition from conventional combat. The briefing had included a new section delivered by an intelligence officer who had arrived from Berlin during the night, a thin man with SS insignia who introduced himself simply as Standartenführer Kessler and spoke with the authority of someone who reported directly to the highest levels of command. Gentlemen, you are aware of the unidentified aerial phenomena that have been observed since operations began. I am here to inform you that these phenomena are being taken seriously at the highest levels. Reichsmarschall Göring has been briefed. The Führer has been informed. We are implementing observation protocols. You will maintain detailed logs of all encounters. You will sketch or photograph these objects when possible. You will note their behavior, their flight characteristics, and any patterns in their appearance. But under no circumstances are you to engage them unless they demonstrate clear hostile action. Is this understood? The pilots had acknowledged understanding, but Kessler's presence and the tone of his briefing had made clear what no one wanted to say explicitly. The German High Command had no idea what these objects were, no capability to counter them, and was terrified that they might represent some Soviet superweapon that would render conventional air warfare obsolete. The alternative, that they were something else entirely, something beyond the context of the war, was too disturbing to contemplate officially, though every pilot in the room had already reached that conclusion privately. Richter's patrol sector on the 6th of July covered the area northeast of Oboyan, where the German 4th Panzer Army was engaged in heavy fighting against dug-in Soviet positions. The ground below was a moonscape of shell craters, burning vehicles, and the geometric patterns of trench systems. Smoke obscured large sections of terrain. Artillery continued its endless work of turning soil and flesh into undifferentiated debris. At 0718 hours, the screeching began again. This time it was not a brief burst, but a sustained sound, lasting nearly 30 seconds, modulating through frequencies that created physical responses. Nausea, disorientation, an overwhelming sense of dread that had no rational basis. Every pilot in the formation heard it. Every radio channel carried it. And when it finally ceased, leaving only the roar of engines and the crackle of static, Richter saw them. 7 discs arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, each separated from its neighbors by exactly the same distance, hovering at 12,000 meters directly above the heaviest concentration of ground fighting. They were larger than he had initially estimated, perhaps 30 meters in diameter, though distance made exact calculation impossible. They rotated slowly, individually, while maintaining their collective formation, the surfaces catching sunlight and reflecting it in pulses that created strobe effects visible even in daylight. Richter maintained altitude and circled at a respectful distance, observing. His wingman, Becker, maintained position, but his voice over the radio carried strain. "Herr Major, my instruments are failing. Compass spinning. Altimeter reading 5,000 meters when we're clearly at 7. Fuel gauge shows empty, but we have 3/4 remaining. Acknowledged. All aircraft report instrument status." The reports came back quickly. Every aircraft in the formation was experiencing similar malfunctions. Not catastrophic failures, but systematic interference that suggested electromagnetic disruption on a scale no known technology could produce. The discs were not attacking. They were simply present, and their presence alone was sufficient to render standard navigation instruments unreliable. At 0731 hours, a Soviet fighter formation appeared from the northeast, 12 Yak-9s flying in 3 sections of 4, heading toward the German ground positions. They had not yet spotted Richter's formation. Standard engagement protocol would have been to intercept immediately, achieve tactical advantage through superior altitude, and destroy as many Soviet fighters as possible before they could react. But Richter hesitated. The discs were between his formation and the Soviet fighters. To engage would require flying directly beneath the hovering objects, entering whatever field they were projecting that caused the instrument failures. And something in the geometry of the situation, the way the discs were positioned, the timing of the Soviet formation's appearance, suggested to Richter that this was not coincidence. This was observation. Someone or something was creating conditions to study how the combatants would react. He made a decision. Grunhertz aircraft. Maintain altitude. Do not engage. Observe only. Herr Major? Becker's voice carried confusion. They are clear targets. I am aware, Franz. But we will not engage. Not here. Not now. The Soviet formation continued westward, oblivious to the German fighters above them or the discs between them. They reached the area directly beneath the hovering objects and suddenly scattered, breaking formation, individual aircraft maneuvering erratically as if under attack, but no shots were fired. No German aircraft had moved. The Soviets were reacting to something else. Through his binoculars, Richter watched Soviet pilots gesturing frantically, pointing upward, their aircraft climbing and diving in evasive patterns against a threat that was not engaging them. The screeching erupted again, loud enough that Richter heard it even without his radio, the sound penetrating the cockpit and making his vision blur. And the discs moved. They did not fly. They simply relocated, disappearing from their formation position and reappearing in a new configuration, surrounding the Soviet fighters, creating a sphere of presence with the 12 fighters trapped inside it. For 90 seconds, the Soviet aircraft flew increasingly desperate patterns, attempting to escape the sphere, while the discs maintained perfect positioning, moving in concert as if directed by a single intelligence. Then the screeching stopped. The discs rose vertically, accelerating to impossible speeds, and vanished into the upper atmosphere in seconds. The Soviet fighters, suddenly released, scattered in all directions, several heading back towards Soviet lines at maximum speed, others climbing to altitude in defensive postures, all of them clearly traumatized by whatever they had experienced within that sphere. Richter's radio crackled with transmissions from other units across the combat zone. The pattern was repeating. Multiple locations, simultaneous manifestations, German and Soviet aircraft being subjected to the same treatment, surrounded, observed, released. No attacks, no destruction, just systematic observation and demonstration of capability. At 0847 hours, Richter returned to base. He submitted his report, adding detailed sketches of the disk formation and timeline of events. His operations officer informed him that similar reports were flooding in from across the entire salient. The objects were not random. They were coordinated, operating according to some plan or protocol that suggested organization and purpose. On 7th July, the phenomena escalated. The disks began appearing at lower altitudes, some descending to within 3,000 meters of the ground, close enough that ground forces could observe them directly. Wehrmacht and Red Army soldiers alike reported seeing the objects hovering over battlefield sectors, sometimes for hours, watching the fighting below with what many described as palpable attention. Tank crews reported instrument failures when the objects were overhead. Radio communications became unreliable. Compasses failed. And the screeching, that omnipresent screeching, became so frequent that soldiers began to anticipate it, recognizing it as herald of the object's arrival. But something else began to happen on the 7th of July. The objects started responding to specific stimuli. When artillery barrages reached maximum intensity, the discs would appear above the firing positions, hovering, observing. When tank formations clashed in close-range combat, the discs would descend to within visual range, positioning themselves to observe from optimal angles. When air combat erupted, German and Soviet fighters engaging in dogfights, the discs would materialize nearby, watching the entire engagement from beginning to end. They were drawn to violence, to the peak moments of conflict, to the instances when human beings killed each other most intensely. And that realization sent a chill through every analyst studying the reports. Because it suggested motivation, it suggested these were not passive observers, but active seekers of something that warfare provided. Whether that something was data, energy, entertainment, or something beyond human comprehension was impossible to determine. But the pattern was clear. On the 8th of July, Major Richter flew his fourth sortie of the battle. By now, the presence of the discs had been accepted as operational reality. Pilots briefed on how to maintain formation if instruments failed. Ground crews checked electrical systems obsessively, trying to minimize interference effects. Intelligence officers compiled databases of sightings, searching for patterns that might provide insight into the object's origins or intentions. At 11:34 hours, Richter encountered the largest concentration yet. 15 disks arranged in 3 concentric circles, hovering at 10,000 meters above the town of Prokhorovka, where the most intense armored fighting of the entire battle was developing. Below them, hundreds of tanks were engaged in close-range combat across a front perhaps 10 kilometers wide. The scale of violence was staggering, shells impacting at rates of dozens per minute, vehicles exploding, infantry dying in numbers that would make the day one of the bloodiest of the war. And above it all, the discs watched. Richter circled at a distance, his formation maintaining altitude, not engaging Soviet aircraft that were also in the area, everyone recognizing implicitly that something larger than their personal conflict was occurring. German and Soviet pilots flew parallel courses, neither side attacking the other, both sides watching the watchers, trying to understand what was being witnessed. The screeching built to a crescendo, so intense that Richter pulled his headphones off entirely, but the sound penetrated anyway, vibrating through the airframe, resonating in his bones. And the discs began to pulse. Light emanated from them in waves, synchronized across the entire formation, creating a strobe effect that was visible from the ground, visible to thousands of soldiers who would later report seeing strange lights in the sky during the height of the battle. The pulsing continued for 3 minutes. Then it stopped. The discs rose vertically, all 15 simultaneously, accelerating beyond visual tracking in seconds. And Richter's instruments returned to normal function. Temperature stabilized. Compass locked onto magnetic north. Fuel gauge showed accurate readings. Whatever had been happening, it had concluded, at least for now. The discs had observed what they came to observe, collected whatever data they sought to collect, and departed. But they would return. Richter knew that with absolute certainty, because the battle was not over. The violence was not finished. And whatever these objects were, they had come to Kursk specifically because of the scale and intensity of the human conflict unfolding here. They fed on war, or studied it, or bore witness to it for reasons beyond human comprehension. But they were drawn to it like moths to flame. And as long as the Battle of Kursk continued, they would continue to manifest, continue to observe, continue to screech their presence into skies that belonged to them far more than they belonged to the human beings fighting and dying beneath them. The question was no longer whether the objects were real. The question was what they would do when the battle ended, whether they would depart seeking violence elsewhere, or whether they would remain, having found something in the skies above Kursk that warranted longer observation, and whether humanity would survive whatever conclusions they reached. The Battle of Prokhorovka on the 12th of July 1943 would be recorded in history as the largest tank battle ever fought, with over 800 armored vehicles engaged in close-range combat across terrain that offered minimal cover. The carnage was extraordinary even by Eastern Front standards. But for the pilots flying above that apocalyptic landscape, the ground battle became secondary to something far more immediate and far more terrifying. Major Richter launched at 0845 hours with a reduced formation, 8 aircraft instead of the standard 12, attrition and maintenance issues having depleted available machines. His mission was tactical reconnaissance and fighter sweep over the Prokhorovka sector, where Soviet armored reserves were being committed in a massive counterattack designed to halt the German southern pincer. Intelligence estimated over 500 Soviet tanks were moving into the area. German forces would be heavily outnumbered. Air support was critical. The morning was clear, visibility unlimited, temperature already climbing toward uncomfortable levels in the cockpit. Richter climbed to 8,000 meters and turned east toward the objective area. Below him, the landscape was obscured by dust and smoke, but the scale of movement was visible even through the haze. Long columns of vehicles, the distinctive signatures of massed armor, the geometric patterns of formations deploying for battle. At 09:23 hours, the screeching began, but this time it was different. Not the pulsing, modulated sound they had grown accustomed to over the past week, but something sustained and focused, like a beam of sound directed with precision. Richter's instruments immediately failed. Not just malfunctioned, but failed completely. Every gauge dropping to zero, every needle falling limp, every electrical system going dark. His engine continued running, the mechanical fuel system still functioning, but every electronic component in the aircraft was dead. "Grunhertz aircraft, report status," he called over the radio. Static answered him. The radio was dead too. He looked left and right. His wingmen were still in formation, but their aircraft were exhibiting the same symptoms. Props spinning, aircraft flying normally, but clearly experiencing total systems failure. And above them, descending through the altitude layers with deliberate slowness, was the largest object yet witnessed. Not a disk, not a sphere, something else. It was cylindrical, perhaps 50 meters long and 15 meters in diameter, rotating slowly along its longitudinal axis. The surface was not smooth metal, but appeared almost organic, with textures and patterns that suggested biological structure more than mechanical construction. It descended to within 500 meters of the formation and stopped, hovering with impossible stability given the size and apparent mass. Richter made hand signals to his wingmen. "Maintain formation, do not engage, observe only." They acknowledged with wing dips. And then the cylinder oriented itself, the long axis aligning with Richter's flight path, as if it were looking at them. As if it had eyes along that axis that could see individual aircraft, individual pilots, individual human beings encased in metal and glass and fabric. The screeching modulated, becoming almost rhythmic, and Richter felt something he had never felt in combat, something more fundamental than fear. He felt recognized, acknowledged, seen not as an anonymous pilot in an anonymous war machine, but as an individual entity worthy of direct attention. The sensation was overwhelming and deeply unsettling because it carried implications about the intelligence behind these objects that he had been avoiding confronting. The cylinder began to move, not along any axis, but rotating in place, presenting different surfaces to the formation. Each surface was distinct. One appeared crystalline, another had markings that might have been writing or might have been purely decorative, a third pulsed with light from within. It was showing itself deliberately, as if wanting to be observed in detail, as if this encounter was as much about being seen as about seeing. At 09:41 hours, one of Richter's pilots, Unteroffizier Georg Schneider, a 19-year-old from Bavaria on his third combat mission, broke formation. His aircraft suddenly dove, controls apparently responding but movement suggesting loss of pilot control. The Bf-109 descended rapidly, not in a deliberate dive, but tumbling, spinning, falling like a machine whose pilot had lost consciousness or whose control surfaces had failed catastrophically. Richter watched helplessly as Schneider's aircraft fell through 4,000 meters in 30 seconds. At 2,000 meters, the cockpit canopy separated, blown away by slipstream, and Schneider's body was ejected, not by parachute, but by force, thrown clear of the aircraft with velocity that no human could generate, as if something had physically removed him from the cockpit and cast him aside. The parachute deployed automatically, and Schneider descended toward the battlefield below while his aircraft continued its plunge, impacting in a field east of Prokhorovka with enough force to create a crater visible even from altitude. The cylinder remained motionless, continuing its slow rotation. Then it moved again, this time approaching another aircraft, Lieutenant Hans Müller's machine, positioned on the formation's left flank. Müller's aircraft immediately entered a flat spin, rotation increasing, nose dropping, despite what appeared to be Müller's frantic attempts to recover control. The cylinder followed the spinning aircraft down through 1,000 meters of altitude, maintaining exact distance, neither approaching closer nor falling behind, as if tethered to the stricken fighter by invisible bonds. At 3,000 meters, Miller bailed out. His parachute deployed normally, and he descended safely. But his aircraft, released from whatever force had been affecting it, immediately stabilized and continued flying. Level flight, steady course, as if under pilot control, despite the cockpit being empty. It flew east for approximately 2 kilometers, then simply stopped in midair, hanging motionless for perhaps 10 seconds before beginning a controlled descent that ended in a nearly vertical landing in an open field. The aircraft remained upright, landing gear deployed normally, engine still running. Richter's hands were shaking on the control stick. What he was witnessing defied every principle of aerodynamics, every law of physics he understood. Aircraft did not fly themselves. Aircraft did not stop in midair. And pilots did not get ejected from cockpits by invisible forces while their machines continued operating without them. The cylinder ascended back to the formation's altitude. It positioned itself directly in front of Richter's aircraft, perhaps 200 meters distant, close enough that he could see details on the surface. The texture that looked almost like scales, the markings that might have been symbols, the areas that pulsed with internal light. And he felt that attention again, that sense of being observed with an intensity that went beyond mere visual observation. It was studying him, analyzing him, understanding him in ways that made him feel transparent, exposed, reduced to data that could be read and cataloged. The screeching changed pitch, becoming almost melodic, and Richter's instrument suddenly reactivated, every gauge springing back to life, every system returning to function, radio crackling with traffic from other units. The cylinder rotated one final time, presenting what Richter interpreted as a ventral surface, then accelerated straight up, achieving supersonic velocity in less than 2 seconds, disappearing into the upper atmosphere, trailing a sonic boom that rattled every aircraft in the formation. Richter's radio immediately filled with frantic transmissions. Other formations across the combat zone were reporting similar encounters. Aircraft being forced down without being damaged. Pilots being removed from cockpits by unknown means. Machines flying themselves after pilots had departed. And everywhere, that screeching, that omnipresent sound that had become the signature of the object's presence. At 10:34 hours, Soviet fighters appeared, a full regiment of Yak-9s, perhaps 30 aircraft, vectoring toward Richter's formation. Standard engagement protocol. But Richter had just lost 2 aircraft to something that wasn't Soviet and wasn't German, and his pilots were rattled in ways that combat had never rattled them. He made a decision that would later require extensive justification in his after-action report. Grunhert's aircraft. Disengage. Return to base. Acknowledge. Herr Major, the enemy is approaching, Becker protested. I am aware. We are disengaging. Return to base. Now. The formation turned west and accelerated, leaving the Soviet fighters behind. It was a retreat, militarily questionable and certainly contrary to standard doctrine. But Richter understood something that doctrine did not account for. His pilots had just witnessed technology that made their aircraft look like toys, capabilities that rendered their weapons irrelevant, and intelligence that treated them as subjects for study rather than combatants to be destroyed. Asking them to immediately engage in conventional combat after that experience would have been asking for catastrophic judgment failures that would get them killed. They landed at 11:22 hours. Schneider and Muller had already been recovered by ground forces and were being debriefed by intelligence officers. Both were physically unharmed, but psychologically traumatized, unable to articulate what they had experienced except in fragmented statements that suggested profound disorientation and fear. Standartenführer Kessler was waiting for Richter at the operations tent. Major, I need your complete account. Everything you observed. The Reichsmarshal is demanding updates hourly. Richter provided the account, omitting nothing, including his decision to disengage from the Soviet fighters. Kessler listened without interruption, making notes, his expression betraying nothing. When Richter finished, Kessler closed his notebook and spoke carefully. Major, you are aware that what you have described sounds impossible. Aircraft that fly without pilots, forces that can selectively target and remove individuals from sealed cockpits, objects that demonstrate awareness and apparent intent. You understand how this will be received by officers who were not present. I understand, Standartenführer, but it happened. My pilots will corroborate every detail, and I believe if you check with Soviet intelligence, assuming they are sharing information with their own command structure, you will find their pilots are reporting identical experiences. We have, through unconventional channels. The Soviets are as confused and concerned as we are, perhaps more so because their ideology does not easily accommodate phenomena that suggest forces beyond material reality. Kessler paused. There is another matter, Miller's aircraft, the one that landed itself. It has been recovered. Preliminary examination shows no damage, no malfunction, no explanation for why it flew without a pilot or how it landed vertically, but there is one anomaly. What anomaly? The cockpit instruments recorded the entire event. Altitude, speed, heading, all mechanical systems functioning normally. But there is approximately 7 minutes of flight time that the fuel consumption data cannot account for. The aircraft used no fuel during those 7 minutes. It flew, maneuvered, descended, and landed using no propellant whatsoever. The laws of thermodynamics were simply suspended. Richter sat down heavily. What does that mean? It means, Major, that we are not dealing with advanced technology. We are dealing with something that can rewrite physical laws when convenient, something that treats our understanding of reality as optional, and something that is now directly interacting with our aircraft and our personnel rather than merely observing from distance. Kessler leaned forward. The question is why? Why now? Why here? And what will it do next? The afternoon brought partial answers. At 13:23 hours, a massive concentration of objects appeared above Prokhorovka. Over 50 discs, cylinders, and spherical craft of various sizes, all hovering in a complex three-dimensional formation above the battlefield where the tank engagement had reached its peak intensity. They remained visible for 2 hours and 14 minutes, during which time every aircraft in the area experienced varying degrees of instrument failure, and every radio frequency was filled with that screeching sound, modulated and layered until it sounded almost like communication between the objects themselves. And then, at 15:47 hours, they all departed simultaneously, not fading gradually or departing in groups but vanishing in an instant, as if someone had simply switched off their visibility, leaving the sky empty and the battlefield below littered with burning vehicles and the bodies of thousands of men who had died while being observed by intelligences that regarded human warfare as entertainment or education or something for which human language had no adequate terminology. The pilots who witnessed that mass departure would later describe a sense of abandonment, of being found uninteresting after extended scrutiny, of being dismissed as subjects no longer worthy of attention. It was not relief they felt, but something stranger, the uncomfortable recognition that they had been judged and found wanting, that whatever criteria the objects used to assess interest or value, human beings fighting human beings had been measured and determined to be insufficient. The objects had come to Kursk seeking something. They had studied the battle with systematic thoroughness, and then they had left, suggesting they had either found what they sought or determined it was not present. Either conclusion was deeply unsettling, because it meant humanity's greatest conflicts, the most intense manifestations of human capacity for violence and organization, were not even particularly noteworthy to whatever intelligences piloted those craft. Kursk had been observed, cataloged, and found ordinary. And that realization, more than the technological superiority or the impossible physics, was what truly shook the pilots who had witnessed it. They had confronted their own cosmic irrelevance. And that was a kind of defeat that no amount of tactical success could overcome. The mass departure on the 12th of July had not been an ending, it had been a pause. On 13th July, the objects returned in numbers that dwarfed previous manifestations. At dawn, radar operators across the entire salient began tracking contacts that filled their screens to the point of uselessness. Ground observers reported the sky darkened by objects in formations so dense that sunlight was partially obscured. And the screeching became continuous, a sonic environment that made radio communication nearly impossible and drove some personnel to the edge of breakdown. Major Richter's sortie on the 13th of July launched into conditions that could no longer be described as air superiority combat. The mission had changed. Command had accepted that conventional operations were impossible while the objects maintained their presence. The new orders were simple: fly, observe, survive, and document. Do not engage Soviet aircraft unless attacked. Do not approach the objects. Maintain altitude and bearing sufficient to avoid interference. Above all, return with crews intact and aircraft functional. It was a defensive posture, an admission that control of the airspace had been ceded to something neither side could contest. And for pilots trained to be aggressive, trained to seek engagement and dominate through skill and courage, it was psychologically devastating. Richter climbed through 10,000 meters and immediately encountered them. The objects were everywhere, not scattered randomly, but arranged in patterns that suggested purpose and organization. Some formed geometric shapes, perfect triangles, hexagons, spirals. Others moved in synchronized groups, maintaining precise distances and executing coordinated maneuvers that would have been impossible for conventional aircraft. And at the center of it all, directly above the heaviest ground fighting near Paneri, was something new. A massive spherical craft, easily 200 meters in diameter, hung motionless at 15,000 meters. It was not metallic like the discs or organic looking like the cylinders. Its surface appeared to be composed of something between liquid and gas, constantly shifting, colors moving across it in waves that ranged from deep violet to brilliant white. And from its equator extended structures that might have been sensors or weapons or something for which human vocabulary had no referent. They rotated independently of the sphere itself, pointing in different directions, scanning the battlefield below with methodical precision. Below them, the ground battle continued despite the aerial chaos. German and Soviet forces were locked in attritional warfare that was grinding both sides down. Tanks burned, artillery fired, infantry died. And above it all, the objects watched with that same intense attention that had characterized their presence from the beginning. But now they were not merely watching, they were interfering. At 0847 hours, reports began flooding in from ground units. Tank engines were failing spontaneously, not mechanical failure, but simply stopping, as if someone had switched them off. Radio communications were being disrupted not by jamming, but by voices that were not German and not Soviet, speaking in sounds that resembled language, but conveyed no meaning human ears could decode. And soldiers on both sides were reporting seeing things that could not be there. Structures materializing briefly at the edges of vision, figures moving through the battlefield that disappeared when looked at directly, shadows that moved against the light source. The objects were no longer content to observe from altitude. They were descending into the combat zone itself, interacting directly with the fighting, and the effects were destabilizing both armies. At 0923 hours, an entire German panzer company, 14 tanks, simply stopped operating simultaneously. Engines died, electrical systems failed, crews abandoned vehicles that suddenly felt hostile, as if the metal itself had become dangerous. The tanks remained in place, undamaged but completely non-functional. Soviet forces advancing to exploit the apparent breakthrough encountered the same phenomenon, their own tanks failing as they approached the immobilized German vehicles, as if the area had become a dead zone where mechanical systems could not function. At 10:34 hours, Richter witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A Soviet infantry battalion, approximately 600 men, was advancing across open ground toward German positions near Olkovatka. Above them, 3 of the cylindrical craft descended to within 50 meters of the ground. The screeching intensified to levels that Richter could feel even at 5,000 meters altitude. A physical pressure that made his vision blur and his head throb. The Soviet infantry stopped advancing. They did not take cover. They did not retreat. They simply stopped, standing motionless in formation in the middle of a battlefield, fully exposed to German fire. And they remained motionless for 7 minutes while the cylinders circled above them, rotating slowly, scanning them with invisible sensors, studying them with attention that suggested detailed analysis of every individual soldier. German forces, witnessing this, held their fire, not from mercy but from confusion and an instinctive recognition that something was occurring that transcended their immediate tactical situation. And when the cylinders finally ascended and departed, the Soviet soldiers collapsed where they stood, all 600 simultaneously, falling like puppets whose strings had been cut. Medical teams from both sides would later reach the area under informal truce, drawn by the inexplicability of what they had witnessed. They would find all 600 men alive, but unconscious, vital signs stable but neurological responses absent. Like the pilots who had been removed from their aircraft, these soldiers had been subjected to something that had temporarily severed the connection between consciousness and body. They would wake within hours, disoriented and unable to remember what had happened during those 7 minutes, but otherwise physically unharmed. The pattern repeated across the battlefield. Groups of soldiers, sometimes German, sometimes Soviet, seemingly selected at random, would be subjected to similar treatment. Aircraft would be forced down without damage. Vehicles would cease functioning and then restart spontaneously hours later. And always, that screeching sound, modulating through frequencies that human nervous systems interpreted as threat at the most fundamental level. By afternoon on the 13th of July, both German and Soviet commands were facing a reality that doctrine and training had not prepared them for. The Battle of Kursk was no longer entirely under human control. The objects were not taking sides. They were not attacking either army systematically, but they were interfering with operations in ways that made conventional warfare impossible, and neither side had any capability to stop them. At 14:45 hours, the massive sphere that had been hovering over Poniri began to descend. It came down slowly, deliberately, settling to an altitude of perhaps 300 meters directly above the town center where German and Soviet forces were engaged in street fighting. And from its equatorial structures, beams of light emerged, not laser-like, but diffuse, broad-spectrum illumination that swept across the battlefield like searchlights, but created effects beyond simple visibility. Where the light touched, time seemed to alter. Richter, circling at safe distance, watched artillery shells hang motionless in mid-flight, suspended in violation of gravity and momentum. He watched soldiers moving at fractions of normal speed, their actions stretched across seconds that should have been instantaneous. He watched explosions frozen at the moment of detonation, fire and debris held in stasis, energy contained and displayed like sculptures made from violence itself. The effect lasted approximately 4 minutes. Then the lights ceased, the beams withdrew, and everything suspended returned to normal time simultaneously. The shells that had been frozen in mid-flight continued their trajectories and detonated. The soldiers moving in slow motion, suddenly returned to normal speed, stumbling and disoriented. The frozen explosions released their energy, creating blast effects that occurred minutes after the initial detonations. And the sphere rose, ascending rapidly back to high altitude, its work complete. What that work was, what data it had collected, what purpose the temporal distortion had served. These were questions that would never be answered. But the demonstration was clear. The objects could manipulate not just space, but time itself, bending the fundamental structure of reality to purposes that remained opaque to human comprehension. Over the next 4 days, as the Battle of Kursk ground toward its conclusion, the objects maintained their presence but gradually reduced their direct interference. They returned to observation posture, hovering at high altitude, tracking the fighting below, manifesting in smaller numbers but with continued regularity. The screeching became less frequent, less intense, as if they had collected what they came for and were now simply monitoring the aftermath. On July 17th, as German forces began their withdrawal from the salient, acknowledging that Operation Citadel had failed and the offensive capability of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front was exhausted, the objects conducted one final demonstration. At 1800 hours, every object present in the combat zone, estimated at over 300 craft of various types, assembled into a single, massive formation above the geographic center of the salient. They arranged themselves into a spiral pattern, three-dimensional, rotating slowly around a central axis, and they remained in that formation for 30 minutes, visible to everyone on the ground, observable by radar stations hundreds of kilometers distant, creating a spectacle that was witnessed by hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides. Then at 1830 hours, they departed. All of them, simultaneously. Not fading gradually or leaving in waves, but simply vanishing in an instant, as if someone had opened a door to somewhere else and they had all stepped through it together. The screeching sound that had been omnipresent for nearly 2 weeks ceased. The electromagnetic interference that had plagued instruments and communications ended. The sky returned to normal, containing only conventional aircraft engaged in conventional warfare. The objects had left. They had observed the largest battle in human history, studied it with systematic thoroughness, interfered with it in ways that demonstrated capabilities beyond human comprehension, and then departed when the battle's outcome became clear. The silence that followed the object's departure was more disturbing than their presence had been. For 2 weeks, pilots and ground forces had operated in an environment where the impossible occurred hourly, where physics was optional and human control was illusory. The return to normal warfare felt like stepping from a vivid nightmare into mundane reality, but with the awareness that the nightmare had been real and could return at any moment. Major Hans Richter was summoned to Berlin on the 20th of July, flown out of the combat zone by courier aircraft, and delivered to a nondescript building in the Tiergarten district that housed elements of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium's Technical Intelligence Division. He was debriefed for 6 hours by a panel of officers that included Standartenführer Kessler, 2 Luftwaffe generals whose names he was not given, and a civilian who introduced himself as Dr. Heinrich Schumann from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Physics. The debriefing was exhaustive. Every sighting was cataloged. Every instrument reading was analyzed. The sketches Richter had made were compared against reports from other pilots, and the consistency was undeniable. Dozens of observers across hundreds of incidents had reported identical phenomena. The objects were real, their capabilities were documented, and their departure left a void in German intelligence that terrified those who understood the implications. "Major Richter," Dr. Schumann said as the debriefing concluded, "you are a rational man. A professional, you have seen these phenomena firsthand. In your considered opinion, what were we dealing with?" Richter chose his words carefully. Not German technology, not Soviet technology, not any terrestrial technology. the capabilities observed: instantaneous acceleration, temporal manipulation, electromagnetic interference, apparent awareness, and intentionality. These exceed our understanding by margins that suggest not evolutionary advancement, but revolutionary difference. We were not observing something slightly ahead of us technologically, we were observing something operating under entirely different principles. The official histories began to be written even before the battle had fully concluded. German records would mention nothing about the objects. Soviet records would be equally silent. The battle would be documented as purely terrestrial conflict, tanks against tanks, aircraft against aircraft, human courage and sacrifice determining outcomes through conventional means. The Screeching skies would be edited out of existence, reduced to classified files that would gather dust in archives restricted to clearance levels most personnel would never achieve. But the pilots remembered, and they talked, despite orders, despite classification, despite the risk. In officers' clubs, in letters home that would be censored, in quiet conversations between men who had seen the same impossible things and needed confirmation they had not gone mad. The story spread, mutating as it passed from person to person, details changing, but core facts remaining consistent. Major Richter returned to his unit on the 25th of July. He flew 18 more combat missions before being rotated back to Germany in September for rest and reconstitution. He survived the war, surrendered to American forces in May 1945, and was released from POW status in 1947. He never spoke publicly about what he had witnessed at Kursk, but his private journals, discovered after his death in 1989, contain detailed entries describing the objects, the screeching, the sense of being observed by intelligence that regarded human warfare as humans might regard animal behavior. One entry, dated 3rd August 1943, captured the psychological impact of the experience. We fly our machines and think ourselves masters of the air. We fight our battles and think ourselves consequential. But at Kursk, I saw the truth. We are observed, we are studied, and we are found wanting, not in courage or skill, but in significance. We matter so little to whatever piloted those craft that they left when the battle's outcome became predictable, bored by human predictability, seeking more interesting conflicts elsewhere in the universe. The Battle of Kursk ended officially on 23rd August 1943. German forces withdrew to defensive positions west of their starting point. Soviet forces prepared for the massive offensives that would carry them westward through Ukraine and eventually to Berlin. The strategic outcome was clear. Germany had lost its last opportunity to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. The road to final defeat was now inevitable, though it would take another 20 months to reach its conclusion. And in the skies above the battlefield, where hundreds of thousands had died and millions had fought, there was only normal air, normal clouds, normal weather. The screeching had stopped. The objects had departed. And the world continued as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The suppression of the Kursk phenomena was remarkably successful, given the number of witnesses and the scale of the events. Both German and Soviet governments had powerful incentives to ensure the story did not spread beyond military and intelligence circles. For Germany, the admission that superior technology existed beyond their grasp would have been devastating to morale and propaganda narratives. For the Soviets, the materialist ideology of communism could not easily accommodate unexplained phenomena. Both sides, enemies in all other respects, cooperated informally in ensuring that the official histories of Kursk mentioned nothing about screeching skies or impossible craft. The German records were systematically purged as the war entered its final phase. Intelligence files relating to the phenomena were destroyed during the evacuation of Berlin in 1945, though copies survived in scattered locations. The Allies, upon capturing these fragmentary records, classified them immediately and folded them into projects investigating similar phenomena reported by their own forces in other theaters. The Soviet records were more thoroughly preserved, but more heavily restricted. The NKVD Commission's reports were classified at the highest levels. Access was limited to a handful of individuals with specialized clearances. The testimony of pilots like Captain Volkov was recorded but never widely circulated. But information, once created, is never truly destroyed. It persists in human memory, in fragmentary documents, in stories told by veterans who needed to share what they had experienced, even if official channels demanded silence. By the 1950s, researchers studying unidentified aerial phenomena began encountering references to something extraordinary that had occurred at Kursk. The details were vague, the sources unreliable, but the consistency was suggestive. In 1952, a former Luftwaffe intelligence officer named Werner Hartmann gave an interview to a German-language newspaper in Argentina. He spoke openly about the objects seen at Kursk, describing them in detail and claiming they represented non-human intelligence observing human warfare. The interview was published before intelligence services suppressed further distribution, but the story had been released. It existed in print. In 1961, French aviation journalist Jacques Vallée published an article summarizing historical accounts of unusual aerial phenomena during World War II. The article included a brief section on Kursk based on interviews with Soviet émigrés and captured German documents. Vallée's account was careful and factual, but it confirmed that something extraordinary had occurred and that both German and Soviet forces had documented it. In 2003, following Freedom of Information Act requests, the United States declassified portions of German intelligence documents captured after the war. Among them were fragmentary reports from summer 1943 confirming that German forces had encountered unidentified aerial objects of unknown origin during Kursk and that these encounters had been investigated at the highest levels. The declassification generated renewed media interest, but the story remained confined to specialized publications. Mainstream historians continued to ignore or dismiss the accounts, citing lack of physical evidence. The official histories of Kursk remained unchanged. The screeching skies were mentioned nowhere in textbooks. In 2015, the Russian Ministry of Defense partially declassified some of the NKVD Commission's reports. The documents confirmed Soviet forces had documented the same phenomena reported by German forces. Captain Volkov's testimony was included, though his name was redacted. The descriptions matched German accounts with precision that made independent fabrication implausible. But the evidence persists. In archives across multiple countries, in testimonies of witnesses who are now dead but whose words were recorded, in physical effects documented by instruments, in photographs that show nothing but were taken during confirmed sightings. The screeching skies of Kursk are not legend. They are documented historical fact, suppressed because the implications are too disturbing. The pilots who flew through the screeching skies are gone now. The last known veteran who witnessed the phenomena died in 2017, but before he died, he gave a final interview. His name was Carl Schmidt. He had been a wingman in Major Richter's formation, and his final words about Kursk were recorded. "We thought we were fighting the war, but we were the war. We were the show they came to watch. And when we had performed sufficiently, when they had learned what they came to learn, they left. We were entertainment, or education, or data collection, but we were never the ones in control. That is the truth that no one wants to accept. We are observed. We are studied. And when conflicts reach sufficient scale, they come to watch. They have always come. And they will continue to come." The screeching skies of Kursk have been silent for 80 years, but somewhere in archives most will never access, in memories that died with those who experienced them, in evidence that persists despite suppression, the truth remains. We are not alone. We have never been alone. And the Watchers continue to monitor our most violent expressions, our greatest battles. They came to Kursk. They will come again. And when they do, humanity will once more confront the uncomfortable truth that our most significant moments are observed by forces that regard us as interesting specimens whose behavior reveals patterns worth studying, but whose individual lives matter not at all. The sky still watches. The screeching, though silent now, waits to return. And when the next conflict reaches the scale that draws their attention, the objects will manifest again, demonstrating once more that human history unfolds under observation by intelligences we cannot comprehend and cannot control. The Battle of Kursk taught many lessons. Most are recorded in military textbooks, but the deepest lesson, the one that remains classified and suppressed and denied, is this: we are not the apex. We are not alone. And our wars, however significant they seem to us, are spectacles observed by forces that existed before we emerged and will continue long after we are gone. The screeching skies remember what we have forgotten, and one day they will screech again.